Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and a welcome to our Zoom audience who are somewhere else. It's a great pleasure to welcome Chris Herbert to talk to us again. Linda and I first met Chris and Jan many years ago, perhaps 25 years ago, when he was Archdeacon of Dorking. But then he got promotion to become Archbishop. No, not quite. A Bishop of St. Albans, and disappeared from our life for a bit. But then he came back to retire in Farnham. And so we managed to get him to come and talk to us about a variety of very interesting subjects. And I think this is your 8th occasion here, Chris,
yeah.
And you're most welcome. And we're greatly looking forward to hearing about the tulip craze.
Hamish, thank you very much indeed. What Hamish didn't explain was that Hamish used to be chairman of the Diocesan Advisory Committee, which was the kind of organization run by the diocese which goes around churches and says, yeah, you can have that stained glass window. No, you've got to put those pews back. And we met there, had the most fantastic time. And when I became Bishop of St. Albans, what did I miss most? I missed being part of a DAC because we used to have a great time on site visits. So Hamish and I have been friends for a very, very long time. So it's a huge pleasure to be back here for the 8th time, you tell me. Yeah, amazing, really, that you keep asking me this. Scraping the bottom of the barrel, really. There we are. I'm going to be talking about art and commerce in the Dutch Golden Age, really in the 17th century. So let's start. Here's a portrait by Johannes Bachart. Does anybody here speak Dutch? I did check the pronunciation on Google, and I think I've got it more or less right. However, this man, so what I'm going to be talking about is his art, the art of some of his contemporary friends and colleagues. And you'll just notice, let me just draw attention to a few things on this particular screen. You may just be able to spot a butterfly up on the top there. You may spot, I think, a toad down the bottom. You may spot a caterpillar going up the stem of one of the tulips. I'll come back to the reason for all those little details. It isn't just artists trying to be clever, but it's close to that. So when you think about tulips, is that all right? I can't see my notes now, unfortunately. So I now talk about being a member of the Diocesan Advisory. Okay, I'm sure I can manage. No, I can manage, I'm sure. I'll do my best. Okay. I put up this image of the man who was really responsible above everyone else for introducing tulips into Europe and therefore eventually into the United Kingdom. He's a man called Carolus Clusius. He was born in Arras, more of that later, but he is a key figure in the development of the tulip and the tulip craze in Holland. He popularized the flower. More of that in a moment. So where did tulips originally come from? The answer is to go back or to go forward if I can. Yeah, there we are. I better explain. On the screen in front of me, I've got two images, one of which is on the screen now, and one is the next one. It's all very challenging when you're nearly 80. So, where did tulips come from originally? They were naturalized in the Tian Shan Mountains. You can just see them above that big yellow blob. You can see Tian Shan in big. There's Kazakhstan to the north. Mustn't go too far away from the camera. Kyrgyzstan to the west, China, Mongolia up to the northeast, China across to the east. That was their natural origin. That's where they probably originated, and they gradually, via various trade routes, made their way or were taken to Istanbul, and from there eventually into Europe. The first recorded, you have to say that, the first recorded account of tulips in Europe was in the house of a merchant in Augsburg. Quite how he came to have the tulips, nobody knows. But that they were recorded there in, I was checking the dates, 1559, and tulips came to our country 1582. That was the first tulips in the UK. So one more thing to note about tulips is I'm not a flower expert, so there must be real experts here who can correct me on this. But there are botanic bulbs, that's wild bulbs. So the ones up in Tien Shan were botanic bulbs. And then there are cultivars, the ones that tulip growers promote, breed, change, develop, etc., etc., etc. It's the cultivars that we're really going to be looking at today. So, going to go back to Carolus Clusius now and say a bit more about him. He really was a very remarkable man. As I say, he'd been born in Arras in 1526. And in that part of the 16th century, Arras wasn't in France, it was in what had become the Spanish Netherlands. Before that, it was in the Duchy of Burgundy. So 15th century, Arras was in the Duchy of Burgundy. 16th century, it moved over to become part of the Spanish Netherlands. His father was very keen that his son should be educated, and he wanted him to train as a lawyer. So he was sent to Louvain, to Leuven, the Catholic university. And there, this young man didn't do anything about botany there, studied law, but didn't get on with it too well, didn't enjoy it. And in any case, although he'd been brought up as a Catholic, he began to be persuaded by Reformation teaching and became a Protestant. So he moved to Marburg and he continued his law there, but he began to develop his interest in theology and philosophy. I've not been able to discover where his money came from because he traveled around Europe. I suppose it would have been his father who was the key player in all of this. And then from Marburg, he went to Wittenberg, which was, of course, the starting point of the Lutheran Reformation in 1517. So by going there to study theology and philosophy, he'd given up law, started reading Greek, started reading theology, started reading philosophy. He became more and more interested in that, and then he decided he would move down to Montpellier. And he went to Montpellier to study medicine, one of the earliest universities providing a medical school in Europe. Not the earliest, that was in Italy. Some debate about which was the earliest, but anyway, Montpellier was one of the early ones. And in the 17th century, if you were studying medicine, you inevitably had to study plants because they provided the source of your medicaments. So let's give an example. Beecham's powders. When Beecham first came into the field of chemistry and producing Beecham's powders, it's because he'd been watching sheep nibbling the bark, I think, of birch trees, which developed salicylic acid and so on. So plants have always been, but were then, especially in the 17th century, absolutely key to the development of medicine. And you'll see there, this is the Botanic Garden in Montpellier, and that's where Clusius started studying medicine. He was then headhunted. He was headhunted by the emperor to go and be a professor in the Imperial Botanical Gardens in Vienna. This is a current picture, which I took off the web, as you can see. I'm not breaking any copyright things here. You can use these images as long as it's for education. So if somebody stops you in the street after and said, "Have you been educated?" please say yes, otherwise I'm in trouble. So that's where he went. He wasn't there long. It was a political reason he didn't stay there long. And he went back to Leiden. I don't you know Leiden in Holland. It's an absolutely delightful town with a fabulous university, just wonderful. And he became professor of botany there. And of course, created a Hortus Botanicus, the botanical garden in Leiden. And what you'll notice about this is that it's a wonderful, you'll see the plants are separated out. This isn't an English cottage garden. These are plants to develop, to use for medicine. And then along the bottom, it's a lovely print, you've got crocodiles and swordfish, and for some reason on the right, a bat. Don't quite know why that's there. But this became a very, very fashionable exercise. And universities, as you notice, Montpellier had a botanical garden. Universities began to develop their interest in botanical gardens as medicine became more and more sought after. So if you think of the Ellis Peters detective stories with Brother Cadfael, based in Shrewsbury, you'll know that he was the medicine man for that abbey, and herbs and so on played, and salves played a large part in his life. So, just to put again in context, there had been earlier botanical gardens in Padua. Now that really was one of the earliest of the Italian medical schools. And if you take a view from looking down on it from a drone, you'll see that it's laid out in a very delicate and very beautiful way. That still exists. Well, Carolus Clusius became absolutely fascinated by what we now call breaking tulips. A broken tulip or breaking tulips are those which have these unusual colors. Normally they're single color, but occasionally that white you can see, or the flares that happens. Now he became fascinated by tulips and by their variety and by the way they broke. What he didn't know at the time, and is only discovered later, is that the breaking process is caused by a virus. So it's not, you can now, but you couldn't then breed tulips so that you develop these wonderful and lovely colors. At the same time, there were other botanists throughout Europe who also became fascinated, and Carolus Clusius became the center of a massive network of aristocrats, basically, and people with time on their hands who become fascinated by tulips. So if people in the south of France or in northern Italy, if they want to know about tulips, then you wrote to the professor of botany at Leiden, and he and they set up a kind of network of people. Put this in our context, we, as in many things, were a bit slow to catch on. And the University of Oxford Botanic Garden came in, 30 years after Leiden or so. But it's still, you can see the way the trend is going. And the Physic Garden, even much later. I know this is Chelsea week, but the Physic Garden, surprisingly, I didn't realize this when I chose this image, full of tulips, of course, which is really rather appropriate. Now, how did this craze begin to develop? I've already mentioned the aristocracy who were involved, and they shared their ideas with no money involved at all. But I'm going to go off piece slightly now. I have a real love-hate relationship with this advert. Why do I love it? Because I too would like to have the money to be able to pass on a Patek Philippe or two of them to my two sons. Of course, having been a priest all my life, the chances are nil. But I recognize the desire many of us have to pass on lovely things to our children. Recognize that. But it's also a very exclusive world, isn't it? Only the really very wealthy who can afford to buy one or two Patek Philippe watches to pass on to their children. Whatever advertising agency came up with a strapline deserves medals. You never actually own a Patek Philippe. You merely take care of it for the next generation. Oh, that's beautiful. It really tugs at me. What it doesn't say is that you never actually own it, but actually you've got to buy one. And that's going to cost you many thousands of pounds. But I do love it because it sort of tugs. And it tugs because it's about exclusivity. It tugs because it's about money that I don't have. It tugs because it's about family relationships. In other words, this is a 21st century example of what was going on with tulips. Tulips originally, when they came to Europe, could only be afforded by really the most wealthy. You never actually own a tulip. You merely care for it and pass it on to the next generation. Well, the same thing was going on. So that first group of people, right at the top strata of society, they loved new things, and they for the love of it, they began to share their ideas one with another and their bulbs one with another. And Carolus Clusius was part of that. But of course, what came into it was international trade. And in fact, the foundation of the Dutch East India Company. So the Dutch East India Company was bringing exotic things from what we would now call the Far East, places like Java and so on. And if you were a collector, if you were, as it were, a 17th century Patek Philippe aficionado, you would go down to the port in Amsterdam or Middelburg, say to the captain of the ship that had just come in, got anything interesting? And he would bring back interesting things for these collectors as a kind of what we might call a side hustle. So he might be bringing back, spices and so on, but he might also bring back unusual plants and seeds. Here's one of the other great collectors, Marie de Primo, who was in fact a Catholic living in the southern Netherlands, what we now call Belgium. She moved north because of the difficulties, the religious difficulties, but she was one of his regular correspondents. So she was part of that initial group who thought, oh, I do like these new flowers. They're very, very lovely. How can I learn more about them? And botany was then beginning to develop its own kind of professionalism. You may recognize the name because the plant on the right is a lobelia, named after that man, Matthias de Lobel. And so we're in an age when plant collectors began to give their names to exotic plants that they got from elsewhere. This is a Flemish writer, 17th century, referring to these aristocratic collectors. They do vaingloriously hunt after strange herbs and flowers, which having gotten, they preserve and cherish more carefully than any mother doth her child. These be the men whose letters fly abroad into Thracia, Greece, and India, only for a little root or seed. This sense of this is kind of Sunday Times magazine in the 17th century, this kind of writing. What did you do if you were a collector and if you were a merchant? You had to plant your bulb somewhere. And tulip bulbs began now to move out of the out of the kind of aristocratic level of society into the merchant class. And if you were really a very wealthy merchant, you would buy yourself a house on Keizergracht or Prinsengracht in Amsterdam. And the council of Amsterdam at the time insisted that your property must have a garden 180 feet long. So the garden became a place where, with your exotic bulbs coming in, or lobelia, whatever it was, you used your garden to display your wealth. Of course, you enjoyed the beauty of these new things, but it was the exclusivity that you were after. Obviously, you could only buy a house such as this if you're already pretty wealthy. At the same time, as the tulip interest began to move from the aristocracy to the merchants, so publishers began to see an opening. And they began to create, with writers, books, catalogues. You'll see in any, I don't know, the RHS magazine, don't forget to get your catalogue from Thompson and Morgan or whatever. Well, this was the equivalent. What's fascinating here, I find, this is a page from a catalogue, flower catalogue, and you'll see that the plants down in that central bit, there's only 4 or 5 to a kind of within a frame. But look where the tulips are, to the right, to the left, up in the top. This was beginning to be a very serious undertaking. Very beautiful, short-lived, but nevertheless, this was how you displayed your plants. And plants, tulips especially, became commodities. This was the most famous tulip of its day, called the Semper Augustus. No one knows the name of the person who first had this bulb, but he was an Amsterdam merchant, it is thought, and he showed this bulb to his friends, and they all wanted one, and they started bidding, and he wouldn't let the bulbs go, until eventually somebody said, well, suppose I gave you 1,000 guilders. So he was very tempted and eventually gave in and sold this Semper Augustus for 1,000 guilders. The problem, of course, for the buyer, and we'll come back to this in a moment, the buyer thought that he was buying a bulb that would do exactly the same thing again. But actually, the virus caused the bulb to get weaker and weaker and weaker. So as the seasons went on, you bought a Semper Augustus for 1,000 guilders. Within about 5 years, you found, as you started digging up the last of your tulips, nothing much left. So it was a bit of a disastrous investment, but a very, very beautiful. And this really was the tops. I think it was eventually one of these was sold for something like 100,000 guilders. It just became mad, an extraordinary craze. And here's another of these catalogues with each bulb being named. So you would pour over that, I don't know, sort of perhaps May, June, July time. And you think, well, when I plant those in the autumn, I'd like one of those and one of those and one of those. So you can see that the tulip has now become a commodity which can be traded and was being traded by numbers of people. It wasn't the only thing that people were collecting. This is a Kunstkammer by Willem van Hecht. It's an extraordinary painting because it's a painting with lots of paintings in it. And you'll notice down in the bottom right here, you'll see this painting. It's a 16th century painting by Quentin Matsys. called The Moneylender and His Wife. And what's lovely about this, this is the shop window we're looking in. She's looking through a book. I can't quite work out what sort of book it is. I don't think it's a catalogue. But you'll notice that just at the bottom there, there's a convex mirror. And he is weighing, I think he's weighing coins or jewels or whatever. But it's kind of commercialization. This is what's going on. People are collecting, they're buying, they're selling. People are setting up as money lenders and money changers. But you notice that convex mirror, where that came from. It was copied as an idea from 100 years previously. The Jan van Eyck Arnolfini, now in the National Gallery. So this convex mirror is utterly, utterly wonderful. Just imagine trying to paint that. So what you have is the name of the artist above it. Johannes van Eyck made this or was here, like Kilroy. And then in the center of the mirror, you've got the back of the couple who are betrothed. And you also have witnesses who aren't in the main scene, which is on the left. The witnesses there you can see in blue. Some people claim might have been Van Eyck himself. To the left, there are rosary beads. And then all around the mirror, in this case, these little roundels are paintings with a little glass disc, a convex disc over them. And they're images of the Passion of Christ. So the crucifixion at the top, all the way around, hugely fashionable object in the 16th century, so 15th century, sorry. So that idea had been copied. I'll just go back. There's the convex mirror there. And so ideas were being collected by artists, one from another. Tulips were being collected. And if you were a very, very wealthy merchant, you would set up in your house a collection of all your paintings. But in this, it's even more dramatic, because you've got down there in the left, the lady with the yellow skirt, her portrait is being painted. And next to her is somebody dressed as a Roman general, goodness knows why, and the little lapdog there in the front. And you've got all your classical statues here. So this is high Renaissance Europe. This is pre-art galleries, before museums were invented. It was the very wealthy who would fill their walls with paintings such as this. Very different from Vermeer. You'll know the Vermeer exhibition is on in Amsterdam this at the moment. I can't go, alas. I'd love to, but I can't. But the simplicity of that compared with what we've just seen is astonishing. I just love Vermeer. I think he's wonderful. Not only were tulips collected, so were seashells, anything exotic. So the East India, or the Dutch East India Company, was bringing back exotic seashells. And if you were really wealthy, you would collect these, like you might collect a Patek Philippe or, I don't know, a Morgan sports car, whatever it was. But you would exhibit it in specially designed cases. So there's an example of a collection of shells, same period, so we're in the 17th, early decades of the 17th century, stuff pouring in to Amsterdam and Middelburg. And you'll notice with this still life by Van der Aalst that you've not only got fruit, and down here on the right, a caterpillar and a spider and a lizard, a trompe l'oeil lizard crawling over the frame. It looks as though it's going to come out at you. You've also got shells on the left. Now, why have these creatures in this painting? Well, it's a sort of vanitas painting, really. It's quasi-religious, pious, I suppose, saying all this may look very beautiful and is very beautiful, but actually it will all gradually rot or be eaten. The caterpillar will eat into the fruit. Butterflies may result, but the fruit will rot. Human life is short and is capable too of rotting. Now you'll know from this painting, if you're a gardener yourself, you'll see a rose, you'll see a Semper Augustus tulip on the left, you'll see an iris at the top, a carnation, I think, on the right, a grasshopper, I think, down in front of us. But you'll know as a gardener that those flowers don't flower at the same time. So this is cramming a season or seasons together. My tulips have been over now the best part of 2 or 3 weeks. The roses are just beginning to come out, but the irises aren't there yet. So as an artist, you're pulling together very, very beautiful flowers and promoting the idea not only of their beauty and reminding people, if they want to think like this, that there is a creator lying behind this. And the world is opening up. That's why you've got these exotic shells. This shows your visitors, gosh, how lovely. I wonder where they came from. So, it plays into human envy. I can't afford those shells. I can't afford a Patek Philippe, but there they are. And at the same time, technology was playing a major part, so that microscopes had been invented by this man. There was a lens at the top, a lens at the bottom, and you could see real detail, possibly for the first time. Some dispute about who invented the microscope, but it was this that meant that people were beginning to see the world slightly differently. It was much bigger than they'd originally thought, all this stuff coming in from the Dutch East Indies. It was more complicated than they'd originally thought. And the microscope helped to develop this way of thinking. And one of the Vermeer people who lived in Delft at the same time as Vermeer, he too invented a microscope, which had a great effect on Vermeer himself and the way he looked at things in detail and separated out. So he didn't do all these kind of lizards and things. He just wanted the simplicity. But just in case you thought this was all new, I've put up on the screen now this 15th century triptych. This was painted by a man who sadly had a number of nervous breakdowns, a man called Hugo van der Goes. And it was, Portinari was a banker in Bruges, and he commissioned this in the 15th century for the family chapel in Florence. So you've got the shepherds coming in from the right, lovely, lovely, lovely faces. You've got Mary and Joseph, the babe lying on straw, but it's the symbolism hidden inside it, which I want to draw your attention to. Firstly, you've got angels on the right, dressed in ecclesiastical garments, copes and dalmatics. So that must tell you something. It tells you this may be a reference to the Mass. This was going to be the background to the Mass in the chapel in Florence. You've got just behind those vases of flowers, a wheat sheaf. And the Christ child is lying on a wheat sheaf, on sheaves of wheat. Why? Well, it's about Jesus being the bread of life. The bread of life becomes the Mass and so on. And then the flowers, I've highlighted them here on the right. You've got aquilegia. Why aquilegia? Because they have 5 petals. They're a reminder of the 5 wounds of Christ. You've got irises. And Iris was the classic figure who brought news from earth to heaven and heaven to earth. And I think, I can't be quite certain, but those red lilies to the left, or orange now, but would have been red originally, faded in the light, they were a symbol, one of the symbols of the Virgin Mary. The legend was that when she cried following Jesus up to Calvary, her tears fell to the ground and up sprang red lilies. And then to the very right, carnations. They too are associated with Mary crying. So even where are we, 125 years before, plus 140 years before tulips emerged, artists were using flowers in a symbolic way in the Netherlands. So the artist painting still lifes. Imagine everything taken away, Virgin Mary, Joseph, etc., just left with the flowers. You can see how the fashion in painting had shifted and changed. In our own country, the key player was John Tradescant. He was a great collector, and he was a great friend of the aristocracy, including the Cecils at Hatfield House. When I was Bishop of St Albans, I had the huge privilege of visiting this and the family lots of time. Stunning gardens. And they commissioned Tradescant to bring exotic plants in, especially after he'd been on one of his visits to Spain. And when I was there, Lady Salisbury was the trustee of the Tradescant Museum right next to the Archbishop of Canterbury's palace in Lambeth. So there's a kind of connection between the Salisburys, the Cecils, and gardening and Tradescant. He himself bought a house in South London, in, I don't know, Southwark or somewhere there, no longer exists. And he began to fill his house with unusual specimens of plants. The one on the right, of course, is a Tradescantia. Now, back to the still lifes in the Netherlands. This is Jan Bruegel the Younger. And again, it's this picture of abundant, extraordinary life, just sort of bursting out absolutely everywhere, all the seasons crammed together. So still life was a way of stopping time to say, look what's happening, all these things together. This is the kind of variety and glory of creation. But the Vanitas paintings became more and more popular. This is by Maria van Oosterwijk. And there's some lovely little details in here. So you've got a butterfly resting on an accounts book. These are the household accounts for the family. And there is a timepiece there in the form of what we might call an egg timer. There's the sand going through. And on this book just here, it says Selbstheit. And that means, that's a reference to the kind of quandaries that human beings go through when they're tempted away from their best side to their worst side. And that's a book about temptation. Should you give in or shouldn't you? There's a half-eaten corn on the cob, strands of wheat, a jar possibly from Delft. The Delft ware began directly as a result of the Chinese blue and white porcelain in China being brought in. Butterflies, a globe to indicate travel throughout the world. And I think, though I can't be certain, this bit of rope on the right looks to me sort of vaguely nautical, but I don't know enough about boats to know whether it is or not. But that's pure vanity. That's a mixture of ownership, death, and the butterfly possible resurrection. But it was also about the skill of the artist. This is really, really close observation of a rose. with a butterfly. So it's expressing the artist's amazing ability to capture the beauty of things like a silk ribbon and a rose. Here's another Maria van Oosterwijk, and you can see various tulips in there and shells down at the bottom. She herself, as we've obvious, was an artist, and this is a portrait of her, getting ready, reading her book, getting ready to paint. And on the left, you've got a still life with Venus, a bathing Venus, looking up, a little statuette, looking up at these collection of flowers. The top one is a sunflower. Sunflowers represented the movement of a flower towards the sun, just as Christ moved towards God. There's an opium poppy in there to say, you know, please don't get hooked on, get yourself smashed by the use of drugs. People began to name tulips. So you'll see them there. The butterman, the first on the left, the nobleman, the second on the left, then to the right, the great plumed one, and far to the right, with the wind. The naming of tulips began to be quite something. You think, oh, I thought, what's this about? Why has this suddenly arrived? You see, it's the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulip. Now, you've seen this hundreds of times. The anatomist was actually a man called Claes, C-L-A-E-S-Z. But he lived in a house which had at its gable end a tulip, not a live one, a carved one. And he therefore became known as Dr. Tulip. That's probably ruined that painting for you. But there he is, his anatomy lesson. Shells continuing to be really popular, showing off. Now, I've put this in because the sense of exclusivity can be seen, especially in the world of art. I'm going to see if I can find this. I don't know whether I can or not. Yes, I actually got a quotation about this somewhere. Oh, what have I done?
Whilst you're repairing that, I'll look at this.
Here we are. So this is what the art gallery says about this. I chose it at random. Within the increasingly confident evolution of Armitage's group sculpture, Standing Figure 1954 is strikingly anomalous. Unlike the composite figures, it has a lightness stemming from the void created by its arms hanging perpendicular to its shoulders. The figure's singularity, in fact, endows it with a quiet magnetism. Far larger than the hand-side Cycladic figurines that may have inspired it, it stands gaunt, head angled quizzically. That's worthy of a Patek Philippe thing, isn't it? You know, you don't. It implies I, the writer, know far more than you, the viewer. So I'm going to tell you that it's Cycladic. Oh, okay. But it's showing off essentially a form of, well, it's human vanity again. That's perfectly understandable. Okay. There were at the time in the 17th century genre paintings, and this woman on the left was very famous. Judith Leister was very famous for genre paintings of people and children. And this is her painting of a tulip for a catalogue on the right. She was not recognized as an artist until the 19th century. All her works were attributed to her husband. But anyway, she was a fine artist in her own right. And she even now has a tulip named after her. That's a Judith Leicester. It's a lovely idea. And it talks about, in the catalogue, our contemporary catalogue, talks about that lovely yellow dash right at the base of the tulip, going up into the carmine and those ivory stripes. Now, what she was painting still lifes, but she also painted happy children. You can see a boy here with was it a grass snake or an eel or something, about to tease his sister, and a cat looking suitably annoyed. Franz de Grebe was an artist. This is one of his portraits, but he too became a tulip fanatic. And if you look very carefully at that piece of fabric on which her right hand is resting, almost like William Morris, but that's got tulips already woven into the fabric. In other words, tulips are beginning to be not only beautiful in themselves, being traded, they're also affecting designers as they create textiles. Same artist, the Haarlem City Guard. Now, if we come to the technical bit, and I shall have to have my notes here because I'm not an expert in banking. I know there are experts in the room. So let's just repeat. Connoisseurs first, then merchants, commodification, more people beginning to buy and sell. The climb in value of tulips began in 1634, grew dramatically in 1636, collapsed, absolutely collapsed in 1637. Now, partly that growth in value was connected with rarity. New and exotic flowers, everybody, they say, everybody wanted them. So if you were the first to know and possess a tulip, you had high status compared to your neighbors who hadn't bought into the fashion. But rarity was also partly caused by the slow growth of tulips in their natural genetic cycle. Because for seeds to become bulbs, I'm told that process can take 6 or 7 years before you can see the flower that results. So bulbs were a quicker solution. If you've noticed if you're about to dig up your tulip bulbs, if you're lucky, you may see little offsets on the side of each bulb. So you can take those off and plant them, and they may, with luck, flower. The question is whether they will carry the same genes, absolutely the same genes, probably do, as the original one. So you can expand. But of course, if you're a trader in tulips, you've got a long wait. First, you've got to either seed, or in which case it's 5 or 6 years, or you get bulbs. Then you have to wait for the bulbs to go, and then you lift them, then you get the offsets, then you plant, and those offsets eventually produce more, and so on. But it's a slow process, which is fate of those two. The Rolex watch problem. Well, the same thing was going on here. I'm going to go back to the Semper Augustus. It was the most sought after tulip in the 1630s. That's the one everybody wanted. And a single bulb, just before the crash, was bought for 10,000 guilders. If you want to know a comparison, then that would have bought you one of those canal side houses in the Princeton Graft. You could have got one of those for 10,000 guilders. So you're just buying a single bulb. Never did a blomist, this is a flower grower, see a more beautiful one than this. No tulip has ever been in greater esteem. That was 1623, and it sold for 1,000 guilders. Within 13 years, price had gone up to 10,000 guilders. As beautiful As beautiful as the effect of the breaking may be, there's a terrible downside. This is what a garden blog I was reading said about it. Because of the harmful effects of the virus, in many cases, the virus is severely detrimental to the health of the bulb, reducing its vigor, making it difficult to propagate. Eventually, the bulb will lose its strength and wither, thus effectively ending the genetic line. That's why there's no more Semper Augustuses around. So if 1 year you put all your money into a bulb, you then planted it, fingers crossed it might come up the same, but within 3 or 4 years, you'd be left with nothing very much. Well, the crash, when it came, happened in Alkmaar. There's a bulb field near Alkmaar now. It was astonishing. Between January and February in 1637, bulbs had doubled in price, and a bulb called Sphistrers went from 125 guilders for a pound of bulbs to 1,500 guilders for a pound of bulbs. The average price paid in Alkmaar in February 1637 for each bulb was 792 guilders. One bulb sold for over 5,000. Note the date. This was in February. This is where we come to the difficult bits, because, of course, the bulbs were still underground, covered in snow. So what are you buying in February? I haven't got the bulbs necessarily. Well, this is where it gets really complicated, but I'll do my best. Okay. You take out a written contract with a person who wants to sell you the bulb, and you agree in that written contract that when the bulb is ready, you will pay him, let us say, 100 guilders. You haven't got the bulb, you've just written you've just got a piece of paper on which is, I promise to pay Mr. So-and-so 100 guilders for a bulb called. So you wait and you wait and you wait. But because the price is going up, your friend says to you, have you bought any bulbs? Yes, I bought a bulb for 100 guilders. And he thinks, oh, would you be willing to sell me that contract? Well, it depends. If I offered you 200 guilders for that contract, would you sell it to me? So if you say yes, you've made yourself a tidy profit already. Now, the man buying that contract, all paper, no bulb anywhere, he then thinks, stupid man, I can get more for that. So along comes C, who says, I'll give you 500 guilders for that piece of paper. Yeah, that's fine. Because on the paper it says, when the bulb is ready, it costs you 100 guilders. So all you've got to do is show it 100 guilders. That's the bulb. You've paid 500, and you expect that will double in price in the next month. So everybody is trying to get on the deal. What we're talking about is not a bulb, contracts. What you might call, I think, I'm not looking at Hamish because he knows all about these sort of things and I don't. You're talking about tulip futures. You haven't got the bulb, you're just speculating about what the future price is likely to be and how much money you're going to make. Well, of course, once a crash starts, you're in real trouble because you haven't got a bulb. All you've got is, by the end of the process, somebody's got a contract price here. So they go back to the buyer and say, you'll know the price has crashed. And he says, yes, but you stupidly bought that contract. So I want 100 guilders for my bulb. And you say, oh, but prices are dropping. Yeah, I know, but that's the deal. Now, lawyers began to be involved. And that became very complicated. And at the same time, the crash happened within literally about 48 hours. There was an auction in Alkmaar. The buyers were sitting there. The sellers were at one end selling their bulbs. The sellers said, who will give me, I don't know, 1,000 guilders for 10 bulbs? And nobody in the room bid for it. So all the buyers thinking, oh, what are we going to do? So the buyers agreed between themselves they would reduce the price. 900 guilders. Nobody's buying. The sellers are saying 800. You're in a Dutch auction, literally a Dutch auction, whilst the buyers are trying to cover their costs. And the sellers are trying to cover their costs, and the buyers are sitting absolutely tight. And as a direct result of this process, the crash was just huge. I mean, absolutely dramatic. They're the bulbs that you wanted, but all you've got is a piece of paper you thought was going to be worth, I don't know, 5,000 guilders. It's now worth, say, 3. So you've lost a lot of money. Meanwhile, the exotic trade went on, and at the height of it, a single bulb represented 3 years' work by a master carpenter. That was the kind of average price. That's where the auction, where it went wrong. The lawyers came in trying to do deals. And artists got into this thinking, well, this would make fun. So they've got a load of monkeys down here buying and selling and God knows what, saying it's a satirical piece. Because in the Netherlands at the same time, you had this kind of underlying morality, which was about thrift and hard work. So that's represented by this lace maker and her lovely little baby. She's sitting at home, not speculating in tulip futures and buying and selling contracts. She's working really hard, and that was an honorable thing to do. At the same time, morality was also being exploited. This was the procuress here on the left, trying to sell the services of a prostitute on the right. I found this advert, I thought it was rather nice. It's for Skoda Fabia from the 1970s, I suppose, 60s, 70s, 80s. If only it was more expensive and not as good. It's a lovely advert. But I'm going to end with this painting. This is painted by a Dutch artist in Isleworth in Middlesex. So the Dutch interest in tulips continues. Here she's got them all together, so they're all flowering at the same time. Lovely, I think a Chinese porcelain jar. So I'll leave that on the screen. But it's a reminder, I suppose, this whole thing of the kind of vanity and the relationship between vanity and beauty. The beauty was absolutely astonishing. And I have to say, as a result of putting this lecture together, I'm now not very satisfactorily growing tulips because I've come to love them. So it's up to you whether you go look for a Semper Augustus when you start trading. But I hope that's at least intrigued you. Thank you.
Questions around the back.
If it's about banking and finance, I know now. Yes, please.
What's the story behind the black?
Behind the
Black.
I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. I mean,
Because that must have been a problem.
yeah. It's.
So, Chris, you need to repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. I'm misbehaving. I've got to repeat the question. The question was about the black tulip. Well, what we're dealing with, again, is vanity and greed, where people are trying to breed the most exclusive. So if you can get a black tulip which nobody else has bred before, you're going to be able to sell that at a huge price, providing the market will stand it. So that's the kind of economics behind it and the morality behind it. I don't know much about the actual breeding process, to be honest. I'm sorry about that. I'm just a very amateur gardener with a few tulips now going over that I've got to lift probably this afternoon when I go home.
Yes.
Yeah. I think this is a guess. Yes. Sorry, this is like Morecambe and Wise. I've got to repeat the question. When was the virus discovered? I think it was 19th century. I can't be certain, but it gives me a chance to say there's the most wonderful book by a woman called Anne Goldgar there, called Tulip Mania, and it's well worth reading. Honestly, it's really, I found I couldn't put it down. And then and also one of Simon Sharma's door-stopping books about the golden years of Dutch art. Those two together will tell you most things. And Goldgar, especially if you want to buy, if you've got a choice just between them, take the Anne Goldgar and you'll become an instant expert on tulips. You need to split the camera, don't you? We might go to that.
I had no idea that the Dutch art was so intertwined with the tulip story. I think we've had a most interesting talk, which has highlighted both these aspects. Chris, you're such an engaging speaker. We'd like to thank you very much for coming to Haslemere again.
Pleasure.